Welcome to our virtual Zoom audience, and welcome to everyone joined with us in person today. My name is Lonnie Moore III, and I am your Master of Ceremonies for this program today. I also serve as Vice President of Marketing for the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust, and I'm a 7th generation direct descendant of the Perkins Dennis family. I'm pleased to have all of you here today. And we have 2 of our board members that are here, and Wade Katz and Patty Jepson. So please welcome them. We also have our advisor to the Dennis Farm, Michael Wakatama, in attendance. So we're very thankful for everybody who's here today. Today's forum is named after my late daughter, Lonaé Ashley Moore. You'll find a biography of her inside of your folders. And I hope today's discussion, titled Connecting the Dots Between 1776 and the Present, you will find very informative. I would like to extend a special welcome to all of our high school and college students who are in attendance, whether virtually or in person. We had a group from Rosemont College. I think there's one representative here from Rosemont College here today. The rest may be joining virtually. But we also have high school students from the Achievement Academy of the Philadelphia Alumni Chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi, for which I serve as the Academy's president. Joined with them were Troy Smith, our Community Outreach Chairman, and Stephen Mittenall, Guide Right Chairman. And I would just ask for the Achievement Academy to be recognized and stand at this time. We're very thankful for the high schoolers not finding it robbery to get up on a Saturday to be with us. So just raise your hand, gentlemen. We're so pleased to have all of our students here, whether you have come as a group or joining individually. Before we get started, please make sure that all of your cell phones are silent or on vibrate mode. Now it is my honor to introduce to you Zean Mason, the Chief Operating Officer of the Museum of the American Revolution and our valued partner for this forum today. Zean.
Well, it's a true pleasure to welcome you this morning. This is the 3rd time we've had the privilege of partnering with the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust on this important forum. And the first time we've done it in this hybrid manner. Last time we were all virtual. And it's looking at the people that are joining us virtually. It was fun to see that they're from all over this country and the world, with a few people tuning in from Paris. So welcome all. And the fabulous Denise Dennis is among those who's participating virtually, and we'll hear from her in just a minute. I always look forward to hearing from Denise because I always leave feeling inspired and hopeful. Denise first reached out to me in September of 2015, which was 2.5 years before our museum opened to the public. And since then, we've had now 7 years of collaboration. And we again are so honored to be with you and your family as we remember Lonaé and engage in this important dialogue. I'm going to take just a minute to talk to you about some programs that we have here at the museum that you might find of interest. And I have to make this work now. This coming Thursday at 6:30, we will welcome Dr. Carrie Winter, who recently brought to life the rare and powerful personal memoir of Jeffrey Brace, an enslaved man who won his freedom through service during the Revolutionary War. In the memoir, he recounts the harrowing journey from enslavement to free farmer to abolitionist. Dr. Winter brought this important work back into the public consciousness when she republished the memoir, supplementing our knowledge of Brace's life and times with original documentation and new material. Following the program, family historian Rhonda Brace, who's a descendant of Jeffrey Brace, will join our president, Dr. Scott Stevenson, to talk about Brace's life and legacy. The other thing that will be exciting that evening, we have found a possible connection between Jeffrey Brace and a recent acquisition of an archive of nearly 200 rare documents that bear the names of Black and Native American soldiers who served during the American Revolution. We need to do more research, but one of the documents in the archive contains the signature of Pomp London, which was a nickname for Brace. So that document will be on display that night, and you can purchase tickets on our website for either the Zoom version of the program or the on-site version, which will be here in this very room. Every Saturday in February, turn this to the next slide. We are presenting a 20-minute first-person theatrical performance about the life of James Forten, a free Black Philadelphian Revolutionary War privateer, successful businessman, and stalwart abolitionist, written by local playwright Marissa Kennedy and performed by actor Nathan Alfred Tate. The performance accompanies the museum's special exhibition down on our first floor, Liberty Don Trione's paintings of the Revolutionary War, that includes a painting commissioned by the museum of Brave Men as Ever Fought, and it depicts young James Forten watching as Black and Native American troops in the ranks of the Continental Army march past Independence Hall to stand the street on their way to Yorktown, Virginia. And we're excited to be lifting up even more stories about the Forten family as we prepare for a full special exhibition on his life that will open just in just about a year, February of 2023. So if we're here again for the forum, that would be something we could all enjoy. And that will explore not only the life of James Forten, but his descendants as they navigated the American Revolution, cross-racial relationships in Philadelphia to later become leaders in the abolition movement in the lead up to the Civil War. And this is a perfect moment and group to tell you about our inaugural Living History Youth Summer Institute, which is part of our new African American Interpretive program that we will be holding for the first time this July and August. It's a 6-week program. It's an intensive course for young adults interested in interpreting the lives of people of African ancestry in the Revolutionary era, and involves guest speakers, research projects, and field study. If you are, or if you know someone who is between the ages of 15 and 21, who loves history, education, theater, visual arts, communications, or costume design, we're recruiting applicants that can apply to the Institute. There's 16 slots for Philadelphia area students, and it will introduce you to, as I said, historical interpretation with a focus on enslaved and free people of African descent. Participation in this course is compensated for students and includes SEPTA passes and transportation to additional offsite tours and field trips. The application deadline is coming up. It's March 1st. So you can find the application again on our website. And speaking of the website, we're proud of the growing inventory of rich content that's there. We continue to add tours, interactive experiences, videos. Our Finding Freedom Interactive continues to win awards for its powerful storytelling about the different paths to freedom pursued by people of African descent during the Revolutionary War. And if you haven't seen it, tune in to the AMREV 360 program featuring Denise Dennett. She is pictured here holding an object we're privileged to have on display. It's the powder horn of Gershom Prince, a descendant of the Dennis family who served and died in the Revolutionary War. And it's downstairs in our Oneida gallery on the 2nd floor. So I hope those of you that are here will get a chance to go down and see it. It's a great example of what we work to do here in the museum, using authentic witness objects to uncover and share compelling stories about the diverse people and complex events that sparked America's ongoing experiment in liberty, equality, and self-government. We offer our deep gratitude to the Dennis Farm Charitable and Trust for their generous support of our work here at the museum, and are delighted to again partner with the Trust to present this important forum.
Thank you, Zean. Since most of you are not familiar with the Dennis Farm and what we do as the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust, we have a short video to share with you. But first, I have a couple more announcements to make. You will find a survey in your form folders. We would appreciate if you would complete the survey of the program and place it on your table before you leave today. If you are watching virtually, you will receive an email with instructions. Also, students who plan to participate in the video contest will find contest guidelines in the form folder. Please read them carefully. Those of you who have joined us virtually will find the contest rules by visiting our website at thedentistfarm.org. We will announce the first, second, and third prize winners shortly after the February 22nd deadline to submit. So I encourage you to pay close attention, take notes, and ask questions. At the end of today's forum, you will have an opportunity to take a tour of the museum provided by one of their staff members. Now, in the spirit of understanding and bringing people together, we traditionally have this activity where we ask each of you just to stand and take a minute or two and greet others that you may not know. Just introduce yourself to them, keeping in mind our COVID safety protocols. And if you're joining virtually, we ask that you give a shout out in the chat to let us know your name and where you are watching from. So we'll take 1 minute to do that before we continue with the program. Okay, if we can begin getting back to our seats. If we can get back, return to our seats, we're going to continue with the program. I see another good Kappa man has arrived, and welcome to have you here, Brother Monte. So thank you. We now invite you to take a tour of the dentist farm.
Welcome to the historic Dentist Farm in the beautiful Endless Mountains of Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. This is the farm's lower plateau, overlooking Martins Creek. But the saga of this land and the people who lived here begins beyond these stone walls, uphill. So let's follow the farm's road uphill through a grove of hemlock trees that passes through an open field to the top of the hillside, where you'll see a monument that bears the names of those who first lived and died on the farm, and who are now resting in the Perkins Dentist Cemetery next to the monument. The family of Prince and Judith Perkins, free African Americans, came to the region from Connecticut in 1793, when George Washington was president, and first settled the farm. Their original house was several feet downhill from the cemetery near a spring. All that remains of their house today is the stone foundation. However, a recent Binghamton University archaeological excavation revealed a great deal about the Perkinsons' daily lives. This field in autumn was a part of the Perkins homestead. During the American Revolution, Prince Perkins was a soldier in the 2nd Regiment of the Connecticut Line in the Continental Army for the town of Norwich. In 1792, he received the sum of 25 pounds, 6 shillings, and 4 pence lawful money for his service in the American Revolution. And in 1793, Prince Perkins made his first land purchase in Pennsylvania's Tunkhannock Township for 6 pounds. He sold that land and subsequently purchased the farm above Martin's Creek. 2 local history books describe Prince Perkins as the fiddler for the community's festive occasions. One author cites this note: 1800, Prince Perkins, 11 shillings, 3 pence for fiddling on the 4th of July. Settlements in the Endless Mountains, inland and far from the coasts were, like upstate New York, the new nation's first frontier. The region was called a howling wilderness for the sound of wolves that echoed through the night. Prince Perkins' daughter, Phoebe, was married to a Revolutionary War veteran, another free African-American from Connecticut named Bristol Bud Sampson, who also served in the 2nd Regiment of the Connecticut Line. Bristol Bud and Phoebe lived with the Perkins family until, after Bristol Bud applied for and received a pension that had become available to disabled vets of the Revolution, he and Phoebe purchased their own land next to the Perkins place. Both Prince Perkins and Bristol Bud Sampson, who now rest for all eternity in the Perkins-Dennis Cemetery, are listed in the database at Valley Forge as Prince Negro and Bristol Bud, among the Connecticut regiments who served at Valley Forge the fateful winter of 1777. In 1818, the year Bristol Bud Sampson applied for his Revolutionary War pension, another free African-American family moved to the mountains of Susquehanna County from New England. The family of James and Hannah Benson Dennis arrived in Auburn Township, Susquehanna County from Vermont in 1818, and their history is fascinating. James and Hannah Dennis were originally from Massachusetts. Hannah's grandparents, Nero and Dido Dingo Benson, were married in Framingham, Massachusetts in 1721. Her parents, Frank and Rosanna Lewis Benson, were married in Concord, Massachusetts in 1777, and Hannah was born in Concord in 1779. In 1804, James Dennis and Hannah Benson were married in Concord by Justice of the Peace A.B.L. Hayward, a Harvard alumnus. Their great-great-great-granddaughter, Denise Dennis, is pictured standing at A.B.L. Hayward's office doorway in 2012. By 1810, James and Hannah Benson Dennis were living on a farm in Chester, Vermont, where their 5th child, their youngest son, Henry W. Dennis, was born. This is a page from the war record of James Dennis, who was recruited by Vermont Lieutenant Thaddeus Stevens and served as a teamster in the War of 1812 before moving to Auburn Township in Susquehanna County with his family in 1818. The 1820 census for Susquehanna County, written in the vernacular of the day, lists colored residents as an addendum, noting that they are all free people. Among the 6 African-American men who are heads of household are James Dennis in Auburn Township and Prince Perkins in Waterford Township, which was later renamed Brooklyn Township. 31 years later, these 2 families would be joined in marriage. When Prince Perkins passed away in 1839, at age 89, his son William Perkins inherited the property. That year, William Perkins entered into an agreement with Henry Dennis, who owned a farm in Dimmock, Pennsylvania, through which Dennis borrowed a Perkins heifer for breeding for a period of 3 years. William and his wife Melinda had only one child who survived into adulthood, a daughter named Angeline, who would inherit the Perkins land one day. On April 24, 1851, 168 years ago, Henry W. Dennis married Angeline Perkins on the farm, and it was noted in a local newspaper. William Perkins passed away in 1858, 2 years before Abraham Lincoln was elected president, 3 years before the Civil War began, and 5 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, leaving the property to his wife and daughter, Angeline Perkins Dennis. Henry Dennis then sold his and his father's farm, and with the proceeds purchased a 100-acre farm with a house built circa 1825 on the lower plateau adjoining the 70-acre Perkins farm. Since then, Henry and Angeline's combined properties have been known as the Dennis Farm. Henry and Angeline now rest in the Perkins Dennis Cemetery at the hilltop. The Perkins Dennis family accomplished all of this during a shameful period in American history when the enslavement of black people was legal. Nonetheless, the family prevailed. Henry and Angeline Dennis's youngest son, Sumner B. Dennis, was named in honor of the United States Senator from Massachusetts who fought for the civil rights of African Americans, Charles Sumner. All 21st century members of the Perkins Dennis family are descendants of Sumner Dennis, pictured at the monument in 2014.
And one. She's my first cousin, and I've known her all of my life. Now it is my pleasure to introduce her to you at this time. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us in person, but she comes to you live through Zoom. Denise Dennis.
Hello, thank you, Lon, for your wonderful introduction. I hope you can all hear me. I can't see whether I'm on or not, but I want to thank all of you for coming today, and I'm truly sorry that I can't be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the superb team at the beautiful Museum of the American Revolution. Thank you all for partnering with us again this year. I'd also like to thank our esteemed panel and moderator. And of course, I'd like to thank Team Dennis Farm for your efforts in making today happen. When our founders in 1776 brought forth upon this continent a new nation, to quote Abraham Lincoln, whose birthday we celebrate today, when our founders brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, there was a little hitch, just a wee bit of a problem. They did not consider people of African descent or even women as a part of those who were equal. Well, as a sign of how far we've come since 1776, although we still have a long way to go, I'm proud to announce that 4 years from now, in the year 2026, when our country celebrates our 250th birthday, the Dennis Farm will be honored. The Pennsylvania Commission for the United States Semi-Quincentennial is presenting commemorative bells to 7 historical sites across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And the first site who will receive a commemorative bell, which you see pictured here, a 4-foot-tall replica of the Liberty Bell. The first one is going to the Dennis Farm in Susquehanna County. And they told me, the commission told me, the reason they selected the Dennis Farm is from those who were buried, the Revolutionary War veterans buried in our cemetery, right to the work we're doing today. You can trace the history of the United States through the Dennis Farm. The person who told the commission about us is with you today at the museum. He is on our advisory board, and I asked Lon to wait so that I could say his name. His name is George Stark. George, wave your hand or stand up so everyone can see you, but it is George Stark who told the commission about us, and he is largely responsible for the bell we're receiving. Give George a hand. As I reflected on what I wanted to say today, it struck me that racism is every bit as much a disease as the pandemic, because racism separates us, makes us live in fear, and it also causes death. The viruses that feed the disease of racism are ignorance, hate, and the absence of truth. The absence of truth. And the best antibiotic for racism, to defeat racism, is the light of truth. And we reach the light of truth through knowledge. That is why every year at this forum, we invite experts to come and talk to our guests and share knowledge that leads to the light of truth, so that everyone leaves empowered with truth to help combat racism. Our country was founded during an age that was called the Age of Enlightenment. And the Age of Enlightenment was a period in Western civilization when humankind was moving from superstition and myth and stories they told themselves to explain phenomena in life. They were moving from that to using reason, to trying to think things out. And a lot of ideals came out of that period. And those ideals influenced our founders, who were human and flawed, but they heard these ideals: liberty, justice, freedom, equality, and they applied those ideals. They set a standard for this new country. Now, granted, they did not live up to those ideals in their own lives because they were human, but they set a standard to which we have all, subsequent generations, have all tried to live up. The Enlightenment, the light of truth. Today, however, we live in an age that is known as the information age. Every day, with the touch of a finger on our phones, our laptops, our remotes, we are bombarded. We are inundated with information. But information is not knowledge. And information won't always lead us to the light of truth. In fact, there is a lot of misinformation available, a lot of disinformation, and disinformation feeds the disease of racism. So we have to be very careful to sort out, and I'm saying this particularly to young people, to sort out the difference between knowledge, which leads to the light of truth, and disinformation, which can take us in a completely different direction. Now I'm going to tell you a true story. It's about a gentleman. He's 98 years old. His name is Lieutenant Colonel James Harvey. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey is from Northeast Pennsylvania, not far from the farm, a place called Luzerne County, and a little town, it's not even a town, it's a place called Mountaintop, PA. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey left Northeastern Pennsylvania before I was born. In fact, my mother was a little girl, but his youngest sister was best friends with Lonnie's mother. He was a Tuskegee Airman. They were the all African-American fighter group in World War II, the 332nd Fighter Group, also known as the Red Tails. After the war ended in 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Harvey stayed in the Air Force and he fought in the Korean War. And in the Korean War, he was the first ever jet fighter pilot, African-American jet fighter pilot in the Korean War. He flew 126 missions and he received the Distinguished Flying Cross for saving African-Americans for saving Americans who were trapped. from his plane, he took out the enemy. And so he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. But the most interesting part of his story is this. In 1949, between the two wars, the Air Force held its first ever Top Gun competition for all the fighter pilots, all the fighting groups in the Air Force. Each group was told to send their 3 top scoring pilots to an Air Force base in Nevada, now called the Nellis Air Force Base. Only one group was all African American, the 332nd, the Tuskegee men, and James Harvey from Northeast PA was one of those top 3 pilots. The contest lasted 10 days, and their group led throughout the competition. They started with the lead, they kept the lead, and they won the competition. However, for the next 46 years, this was not acknowledged. This story was hidden. And when they would list, each year after when they held the contest, they would list every winner for every year. And for 1949, the very first one, they would list unknown, 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 year after year. Finally, in 1995, someone decided to look into this. And the truth was brought into the light that the first winners of the inaugural Top Gun competition was the all African American 332nd Tuskegee group. And after that, they were acknowledged. A woman historian in Georgia heard about this because it also had been their trophy that they received, a 3 feet tall silver trophy, was reportedly lost and never found. So this historian from Georgia took it upon herself to track down the trophy, and it took her only 5 days. It was in a storage facility owned by the Wright-Patterson Air Force Museum in Ohio. And when she asked why it wasn't on display, she was told it will never be on display. Well, that too was soon remedied. The trophy is now on display in that museum. And in truth, Lieutenant Colonel Harvey and his fellow pilots have since then been honored. He is 98 years old. He'll be 99 in July. He has been honored and their achievement acknowledged by a grateful nation. The omission of truth, hiding truth, also feeds the disease of racism. Because by omitting the truth, we allow lies to flourish. I'm telling you all of this today because one of our panelists, Dr. Jen Janofsky, is going to tell you a story of something that has been hidden since the American Revolution. Story similar to the one I just told you about Lieutenant Colonel Harvey, which is why we must continue to seek the truth. And in Dr. Janofsky's case, she is the person who took it upon herself to bring into the light the story from the American Revolution. And I will let her tell you the particulars of that story. Every year when I give my remarks, and I do go on, you can tell, I always say that I hope each of you leaves here today with more tools in your toolbox for overcoming racism in your lives and your communities. And I know that there are a few people in the audience who have known me since I was, 12. Knows I've been talking about all this stuff since way back then, but that we will all have more tools for combating racism in our lives and communities. The information you receive here today, the knowledge that will lead you to the light of truth, is your weapon for combating racism. You have an answer for people. You're each an ambassador for the truth. Now, I'm smiling already. People always ask me, is there another generation who will carry on the work of the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust, along with the professionals who make this happen? And I'm pleased to say, yes, indeed, there is an 8th generation who will carry on. Today, for the very first time, a member, a leader of the 8th generation is going to speak to all of you. I will let him tell you about himself, because if I start to talk about him, I am so enormously proud of him that I will get carried away. So I'll let him tell you about himself. Let it suffice to say that he is a fine young man, just like his dad, whom you've met. So now it is my pride and pleasure to introduce the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Prince Perkins and Lonaé Moore's twin brother, someone I love dearly, Mr. Lonnie Moore IV.
Thank you, Denise, for the great introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lonnie Moore IV. I'm Lonaé Moore's twin brother and the 8th generation, direct descendant of the Perkins Dennis family. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I want to greet each of you anyway. I recently graduated from Monmouth University, where I majored in communications and political science and was also captain of the football team. Our football team was diverse. We came from different backgrounds, represented different ethnic groups, colors, and sizes, and we had different skills. We worked together as one team, moving toward the same goal. In our case, that goal was winning a championship, which we were able to do twice. Our differences were our strength. If the United States, if the world is going to continue to thrive, we human beings have to come together, just like members of the team, remembering that diversity makes us stronger. This forum helps bring us together by giving us more tools for overcoming the racism that seeks to divide us. I'm proud to be a part of the forum as my sister was. In years ahead, no matter what else I do in life, I'm committed to playing a leadership role in the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust, continuing our family's legacy and bringing people together for the common good. Thank you and enjoy the forum.
Thank you, Lon. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for today's panel discussion. Adrian G. Whaley is an educator and history lover who currently serves as Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Museum of the American Revolution. Adrian earned her bachelor's degree in African American Studies from Harvard University and her master's in education from the University of Pennsylvania. She has worked in both art and history museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the African Museum in Philadelphia, and the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum, and loves the potential for objects, artifacts, and primary source documents to enrich student learning experiences. She carries her love of history and for uncovering the stories of common people into her spare time as an avid genealogist, researching her own family history, and as a programming chair and former president of Philadelphia's African American Genealogy Group. As both a museum educator and as a genealogist, she has presented on television and in workshops and conferences, both locally and nationally. Please welcome Adrian.
It's always so weird to hear other people give your full introduction, but I apologize because Jen, I'm about to inflict that upon you. I want to welcome everybody here to the museum, whether you are joining us physically on site or if you all are joining us via Zoom. We're so grateful to have you here. So you all know that the theme of this forum is It Begins with Each of Us, Fostering Racial Understanding. And this year's theme is very specific. It's connecting the dots between 1776 and today. So the question that we're really exploring is, how might American life have been different if the stories, the experiences, the contributions of people of African descent, particularly from the founding era of this nation, had been remembered purposefully, if they had not been sometimes willfully lost, destroyed, forgotten, and so on and so forth? How politically, economically, socially, our nation might have been different. But this isn't just an exercise in speculative history. This is also about the potential for the future. So the question that we're asking today then is, how can we take the stories, the information that we gain today from our wonderful speakers, how do we take that and how do we use it to implement powerful, positive change as we leave this space, whether it's virtually, whether it is on site, and we carry what we've learned into the world? How do we use it as a tool, as Denise said? How do we use it as a weapon to create positive change? So the two speakers that we have with us today are Dr. Jen Janofsky and Michael Idriss. So let me tell you about our first speaker, and then we'll welcome her onto the stage. When she's finished her presentation, I'll then introduce Michael Idriss, and then he will give his presentation, and then we'll sit down and have a conversation that's going to be informed by the questions that you all ask, both via Zoom and here in person. So if you're listening on Zoom and you hear something interesting, you can go ahead and drop that into the chat whenever you want, and then we'll start pulling that out when it's time for the conversation. And for folks who are here on site, Lonnie is going to be moving around with a microphone. And so he will make sure to pass that to you if you raise your hand and indicate that you all have a question. All right. So Dr. Jennifer Janofsky is the Giordano Fellow in Public History at Rowan University and the director of Red Bank Battlefield Park in National Park, New Jersey. She received her BA from the University of Scranton, her master's from Villanova University, and her PhD from Temple University, where she studied early American history and public history. In 2004, she served as the Barra Dissertation Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Hopelessly Hardened: The Complexities of Penitentiary Discipline at Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary, which appears in Buried Lives: Incarcerated in Early America, edited by Richard Bell and Michelle Tarter. She teaches topics in public history, American material culture, pre-Civil War America, and directs the Internship in History program. And as director of Red Bank Battlefield Park, she has overseen numerous historic preservation projects, curated exhibitions on colonial life and battlefield history, and directed new research initiatives, including the Black Soldiers Experience at the Battle of Red Bank, which I'm so excited to hear about this afternoon. So, Dr. Janofsky.
Adrian's right, it is really weird to hear that. Before I start my presentation, I just want to let you know that one of the primary sources in the presentation today uses a racial epithet. And I just want to make you aware that I will give you a heads up that that source is coming, and I will be referring to it as the N-word in the presentation. So today, I'd like to talk to you about the Battle of Red Bank. I'll figure out the clicker sooner or later. So the Battle of Red Bank took place on October 22nd, 1777. I'm sure, I know there are folks listening and folks in the room who are familiar with the Battle of Red Bank, but I'm assuming that most of you are unfamiliar with it. So what if I told you that the Battle of Red Bank was one of the greatest upset victories of the American Revolution? In September of 1777, Philadelphia fell to the British. The British were hungry and in urgent need of supplies, but Patriot forces had denied them access to the Delaware River. Underwater obstructions of sharpened sticks, known as chevaux de frise, threatened to pierce the hulls of British ships. 3 forts worked to police traffic along the river: Mifflin on the Philadelphia side and Billingsport and Mercer on the New Jersey side. As you can see from the slide up here, this is a map where Red Bank is on the bottom of the screen and Mifflin is towards the middle. And you can see the British ships trying to approach, and the chevaux de frise and the forts did an excellent job of keeping them from accessing the river. Here's a better vision of those chevaux de frise. So, caught in the middle of all of this drama between the British and the Americans were Quakers James and Ann Weidel. James and Ann Weidel owned the plantation where Fort Mercer had been constructed. It was a generation of farmers who had really invested a lot of tremendous time and energy in their fruit orchards. And the fruit orchards and all of the logging material located at the site actually became the raw materials for Fort Mercer. And desperate to avoid any semblance of participation, the Weidels found themselves distrusted by loyalists and patriots alike. And you can see this is the James and Ann Weidel house, which is open to visitors in the spring. So, desperate to open the river on October 22nd, 1777, Hessian forces attacked Fort Mercer. If you liked playing the odds in 1777, you would not have put your money on this guy, Colonel Christopher Greene, and his Rhode Island regiment. So Greene's regiment included just under 500 people. And so he has a small force compared to the Hessian regiment, which numbered close to 2,000. And in charge of the Hessian regiment was Colonel Emil von Donop. But what happened that day was a completely unexpected victory for Greene and his men. So they didn't just beat the Hessians that day, they absolutely crushed them. The battle itself lasted just under an hour and produced almost 400 Hessian casualties, including the deaths of their leader, Emil von Donop. The Weidel House, which you had just seen, served as a field hospital as mass graves consumed the once bucolic farm. It was a stunning victory for the Patriot forces. Of those 500 troops defending Fort Mercer, 56 were African Americans. An integrated unit effected one of the greatest upset victories in the Revolution, but you're not going to read that in most history books. In recent years, historians have explored the role of memory, monuments, and commemoration. How the Revolution's key moments are remembered, and by whom, generate interesting questions regarding commemoration, race, and memory. Indeed, historians and the public remember the Battle of Red Bank as a remarkable Patriot victory. The prevailing narrative is a story of pluckiness, leadership, and courage, a victory against incredibly long odds. Absent from most narratives of the battle is the story of diversity, specifically the Black experience at Red Bank. While most historians have not taken up this question, there's also a long history of denial. For example, in 1927, local historian Frank Stewart concluded the swarthy complexion of the Frenchman gave origin to the report that there were some Negroes under Colonel Greene. This presentation explores the history of this absence, documents attempts by the Black community to incubate this memory, and the role Black participation at Red Bank has played in national conversations regarding patriotism, citizenship, and loyalty. In 1831, Philadelphia's most prominent resident, Black resident, James Forten, wrote to abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. In the letter, Forten expressed concern about the recent popularity of colonization societies. He argued against them, stating, "We are contented in the land that gave us birth and which many of us fought for during the Revolution." He shared with Garrison his memory of seeing the New England regiments in 1777, noting them as brave men as ever fought. I'll just to pause for a moment. I hope you do see the Troiani painting at the end of the exhibit, which captures the moment of Forten observing the Black regiment. He writes of the overwhelming victory of Colonel Christopher Greene at the Battle of Red Bank, but of Black participation in the battle, he sadly concludes, all this appears to be forgotten now. In 1845, local Gloucester County lawyer Isaac Mickle published Reminiscences of Old Gloucester. Typical of histories produced at the mid-century, Mickle offers interesting tidbits of local lore mixed with detailed retellings of famous moments in history. His work documents the presence of Black soldiers at the battle. His source for this information is, quote, "a respected friend." Mickle states, of the men under Colonel Greene in this action, many were Blacks and mulattoes. He goes on to explain that this friend was in the fort the day after the battle and, quote, "cannot be mistaken as to the point." The lengths to which Mickle goes to document Black participation, arguing he cannot be mistaken, suggests that by 1845, the presence of Black troops at Red Bank was in question. Just 6 years later, military historian B.J. Losing visited Fort Mercer in 1851, and documented his understanding of the battle. Absent from his narrative are any nods to Black participation. He spoke with Lewis Weidel, the grandson of Ann and James, who recounted that Ann's faith directed her to stay at the house during the battle, minister to the injured Hessians, and act like, excuse me, an angel of mercy. If there was going to be a hero that day, it was the devout Quaker, Ann Weidel. Pardon me. By the 1850s, Red Bank was emerging as a popular tourist destination. Yearly battle reenactments drew visitors to the site. And in 1829, Pennsylvania and New Jersey residents dedicated a monument to the battle and situated it on a prominent bluff overlooking the Delaware River. Emil von Donop's grave enticed relic hunters who pillaged it for souvenirs. Battle reenactments, a monument, relics, and Lewis Weidel's recollections contributed to a public memory devoid of Black participation at Red Bank just 20 years after James Fortin penned his note and 6 years after Mickle's strenuous efforts to document their efforts. Philadelphia's Black community, however, worked to keep these memories alive, even as white society crafted a narrative around Red Bank exclusive of those experiences. Indeed, the community had much to celebrate as the Civil War approached. Home to the largest free Black population in the country, the city teamed with Black churches, temperance societies, and literary clubs. As early as the 1840s, the community organized parades to celebrate Emancipation Day, the day Great Britain ended slavery in the British Islands. In 1861, the leadership of Mother Bethel Church organized a trip to Red Bank Battlefield to celebrate that important holiday. Several hundred church congregants and the Children's Sabbath School attended. That Mother Bethel organized this trip is significant in discussions of Black memory and history. Mother Bethel is perhaps the greatest incubator of Black historical memory. The church and its leadership ensured their children understood their contributions to American history and the significant role they played in the Revolution. Red Bank Battlefield, in the organizers' minds, would provide the perfect backdrop to celebrate Emancipation Day as the city buzzed with Union activity and excitement. When their boat disembarked from Philadelphia, a Black band began to play. And as the boat glided past the Philadelphia Navy Yard, it transitioned into the Star-Spangled Banner. As they passed other boats, a participant nodded, hats, kerchiefs, capes, shawls, and whatever handiest were waved. He concludes no colored camp meeting could ever equal that scene in exciting detail. At the battlefield, the day carried on with popular games such as Blind Man's Bluff and walks along the Delaware River. Others, quote, were engaged in selecting the various spots marked out in the history of the battle. After a fun-filled day exploring the battlefield, the crowd left for Philadelphia with a participant noting they were much happier, if not wiser, than we left for our homes, for this long celebrated spot of colored American patriotic achievement. He concluded, this is the place at which colored men so nobly defended the city of brotherly love. With the memory of Red Bank burning bright in Philadelphia's African-American community, it was only natural that they campaigned for participation in the Union war effort. Black abolitionist Alfred M. Greene offered an impassioned argument for their enlistment in April of 1861. He stated, these colored soldiers should be attached to the Home Guard. They will make Herculean defenders. Colored men, it should be remembered, fought the glorious Battle of Red Bank when the city was in peril in 1777. The heroic actions of Black troops at Red Bank rallied communities throughout the greater Delaware Valley. Gouldtown, a small historically mixed race community in Cumberland County, joined in the excitement. Residents formed volunteer units, drilled in the streets, and petitioned the government to raise a Black regiment. In their history of Gouldtown, William Stewart and the Reverend Theophilus Stewart argued, our people remembered the heroic conduct of the Black and colored soldiers at the Battle of Red Bank during the Revolution, in which they gloried, and they thought to emulate the example of these men. When the government denied their petition to participate in the war effort, the lighter complected members of the community volunteered and passed for white. Of course, the sight of Black men parading and rallying for enlistment did not set well with many white communities. In August of 1862, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, someone ran an advertisement recruiting Black men. The Patriot, a local newspaper, reported the whole thing was, quote, evidently a burlesque, a hoax, a sell, if you please, at the expense of the valiant darkies of Harrisburg who are so anxious to fight. The author states that arguments in favor of recruiting Blacks based on their heroics at Red Bank were, quote, monstrous assertions, historically incorrect. And this is the site coming up where you should be aware. He continued, it would not be very complimentary to the Hessians who reside in Harrisburg to say that their ancestors were whipped at Red Bank by N-word, even if there was any truth in the assertion, but there is not. As the war raged on and debates continued on whether or not to recruit Black troops, Lewis Weidel, grandson of Ann and James, lost the family's plantation and home. In 1871, the United States government acquired it for use as a military reservation. By all accounts, the property had not been well maintained for years, and while the historic Weidel House employed a caretaker, the remains of Fort Mercer and the 1829 monument remained in terrible disrepair. The monument had been the target of vandals almost since its dedication. In the late 1800s, the property received renewed attention as the area on the Delaware River developed a reputation as a holiday spot. Local residents were increasingly alarmed at the number of relic hunters and vandals as public momentum for better preservation of the site picked up steam. In 1902, members of the Sons of the American Revolution visited the site toward the Weidel House and paid particular attention to the state of the 1829 monument. Their suggestions for improvement included a seawall to protect the bluffs, aggressive landscaping, a new fence, and also the construction of a new, much larger monument. Successful in their lobbying efforts, with $15,000 allocated by the state of New Jersey, a monument commission worked to identify a location, architect, and design. Local newspapers buzzed with excitement, documenting the comings and goings at the battlefield. In the midst of this, an editorial appeared in August of 1905 in the Jersey City News by Eugene M. Gregory, a Black lawyer from Newark. Gregory, a Harvard graduate and one of the first African Americans to play on the baseball team, was an active leader in Newark's Black community. He opens his piece noting that the monument commissioners publicly committed to gathering the complete history of the 1777 battle. Given their charge, he wishes to bring to their attention the part played by, quote, the colored men of Rhode Island. He concludes, with these facts established, it would seem most proper and fitting that the inscription upon the monument or the design convey the knowledge that courageous Negro soldiers helped to defend Red Bank and that the heroic Colonel Christopher Greene was perhaps the most conspicuous figure in the revolution in command of colored troops. 1 year later, Gregory again argued for recognition of Black participation. This was in an article published in the Colored American magazine. He states, important as this battle was to the American cause, inspiring as it is for the bravery displayed, it is significant also in another aspect. Side by side with the white soldiers, meriting equally with them the glory of the defense, were many Negroes. Again, he references the key role Colonel Christopher Greene played in the war, referring to him, this is one of my favorite citations, as the Robert Gould Shaw of the Revolution, Robert Gould Shaw of the Massachusetts 54th. So, on June 21st, 1906, thousands of spectators gathered for the unveiling of the new monument. Thousands of people gathered, parades, picnics, and speeches filled the day. But absent from any speeches or any monument text was any mention of Black participation in the battle. Absent from any archival sources are references to the Black community. On this day, Philadelphia's Black community stayed home. Clearly, the monument and its dedication was by design for white audiences, right down to the monument text remembering the gallant actions of Hessian leader Colonel Emil von Donop. This is the monument. And here is the placard that remembers Colonel Emil von Donop. So America's enemy earned a place of honor on that monument, but Black troops had not. The 1906 monument was an opportunity to address a historical wrong. Instead, with the monument's dedication, Black participation had been erased from the historical landscape. Historians don't usually engage in the work of counterfactual history, the what if this happened or what if that happened. But today I think it's a worthwhile exercise. I recently had a conversation with my colleague Wade Katz, and he asked, what if when that monument was unveiled, rather than featuring a white soldier, it was an African-American soldier? How might our understanding of that battle, that moment in American history, have been changed? Would we remember our country's history differently? Clearly, the last year has shown us, with the removal of so many monuments, the power that they play in influencing historical memory. I think what makes the absence of Black participation in the historical record so remarkably sad is that the one person who could have done so much to preserve this memory did not live to see the end of the war. On May 14, 1781, New York loyalists dragged Colonel Christopher Greene out of his bed and brutally murdered him. Following the monument's dedication, the remains of Fort Mercer and the Whitehall House evolved into a 44-acre park governed by Gloucester County's Department of Parks and Recreation. In 2019, we received a grant from the New Jersey Historical Commission to research the role that African Americans played at the Battle of Red Bank. We worked with Dr. Robert Seelig, who is our project historian, and his well-documented analysis showed us that roughly 56 African Americans participated at the Battle of Red Bank. And thanks to Bob's research, we learned about Thomas Reynolds, who had enlisted only 5 months prior to the battle, injured by falling timber, never fully recovered from his injury, and in 1781 was transferred to the Corps of Invalids. We learned of Moses Weeks, who died on September 1st, 1778, possibly from injuries sustained at the Battle of Monmouth. And we learn of Prince Childs, a veteran of Red Bank, a veteran of that cold winter at Valley Forge, who died trying to protect Colonel Christopher Greene from murdering loyalists. These compelling stories demonstrate the lengths African-American soldiers would go to in their fight for freedom. Since this research, Red Bank Battlefield has developed public programming to offer a more inclusive and diverse interpretation of the battle. Today, battlefield tours, new historical signage, educational programs, as well as social media posts are reached by new audiences. And so this is, if you're familiar with Philadelphia, Black history, Joe Beckton, of course, is a good friend to Red Bank Battlefield, and we always appreciate having him in the park. And this is a pop-up exhibit that the state of New Jersey offers for free for all cultural and local institutions who want to have a program on Black history that was really, really quite popular with our visitors. So one of the more challenging aspects of working in public history is helping our visitors understand that participants in historical events do not know how their story ends. If we pause to consider that moment when 2,000 Hessian troops confronted Fort Mercer, I encourage all of us to think about how that felt in the fort. Was it terrifying? Yes. Was it adrenaline filled? Absolutely. Imagine Colonel Christopher Greene's composure with all eyes locked on him in that moment. And now imagine Greene's eyes on his men. When we envision that moment, we need to remember Eugene Gregory's words, side by side, African-American and white soldiers under Greene's steady leadership pulled off the unthinkable. I'm proud of the work we've done at Red Bank, but more work needs to be done to revise the historical record. Our small park is pushing back against 200+ years of a singularly white narrative. In Silencing the Past, Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot argues, lived inequalities yield unequal historical power. Museums, historic sites, and cultural institutions are uniquely positioned to engage in this kind of work. Every day, they address the inequality of historical power. We know as historians, as museum professionals and cultural leaders, that the words of National Park Service Ranger Betty Reed Socken are true. What gets remembered is a function of who is in the room doing the remembering. So I'm going to throw a little bit of a hand grenade into the room right now. So academic historians, this is your heads up. And if you disagree, we can meet outside to talk about this. You don't need to be a professor of public history or have any advanced degree to be a public historian. And these are fighting words, I recognize this, but from what I have seen as a public historian for the past 20 years, is that the best history work takes place at the local level by people who have a passion to contribute and preserve the historical record. I constantly tell my students in my public history classes, the best public history happens in unexpected places. Your local historical society, your public library, your arts and community centers, your YMCAs. We've seen at Red Bank Battlefield and here at the Museum of the American Revolution and in Northeast Pennsylvania at Dennis Farms that historians, and I cast a really large net when I use that word historian, are uniquely armed with the ability to interpret silences in the historical record. I encourage all of us to think more deeply about memory, patriotism, and citizenship for all of us to work to bring to life the remarkable stories of James Fortin, Moses Weeks, and Prince Perkins of Dennis Farm. Thank you.
I already feel energized, and we have another excellent presentation about to come. So let me tell you all about our next speaker, who I am very privileged to get to work alongside every day. Our next speaker is Michael Idriss. He is the African-American Interpretive Fellow here at the Museum of the American Revolution. He's a graduate of Bach Vocational High School in South Philadelphia, and he began his career in social services before pursuing a passion for history. He earned an associate's degree from Delaware County Community College, then graduated with an honors distinction in history and a minor in Africology and Africana Studies from Temple University in 2019. Michael has served as a guide with Urban Adventures and as a tour director for Katika Experiences, sharing stories of Philadelphia's historic district and the city's deep African-American history. He was named North American Tour Hub's 2019-2020 Guide of the Year, which we have seen in practice here at the museum. In his current position, he works with costumed interpreters of African descent who share the stories and experiences of Black people during the Revolutionary era. He's also a fan of Philadelphia's professional sports teams and enjoys spending time with his wife, Abby, and his son, Jabari, for whom he does so much of this work. So Michael, come on up.
Good afternoon, greetings to everyone. I'm just want to take a step back for a second to say thank you to Dennis, thank you to Daryl, Lonnie, everyone is connected with the Dennis Farm, and of course my colleagues here at the Museum of the American Revolution. I want to thank you all for being here today. It was 2 years ago that I was a guest and was asked to come, and I brought my group from Katika here. So to be able to present today, that full circle really means a lot to me, and I get to share my passion. So my topic, threading the dots, connecting revolutionary past to the present through people of African ancestry here in Philadelphia. So I'm going to start with an introductory question, and now I'm so glad that we have these notepads at our desk. And here are just a couple questions that I want you to think about, and then if you get the opportunity to actually share these with yourselves, and I'll have them on the back end as well. So who was the person or event where you first encountered the experiences and perspectives of the people of African descent? And when you encountered the stories of people of African ancestry in school, did those individuals speak for themselves? And this is a really important question, especially as someone who was born and raised here in Philadelphia, but who also didn't always know and didn't have the opportunity to hear the voices of those that really started this road for us. So just to give you a bit of an overview, this presentation will examine the substantive understanding of the contributions of people of African descent during the Revolutionary era. And we as citizens all miss out on that with acknowledging how we are inextricably linked to this period. So we're going to do this through two individuals who I've grown to know a lot about. One that I actually portray in costume, Cyrus Bustle. We are lucky enough to have a descendant of the Bustle family here today. And also, like Jen mentioned earlier, the important work of James Fortin. So to give us a context about today, if you know about the civil unrest that took place after following the death of George Floyd back in 2020 in the midst of the raging pandemic, there was an amazing quote that came from Philadelphia President of City Council, Darrell Clark. And he was asked about this. And here are the stats. Philadelphia, poorest major city in America, 2/3 Black, 2% of businesses are owned by African Americans. Now, you need some context when you take this information in. Well, where we begin, the 1630s is where you saw the first sprinkles of people of African descent, a part of the Swedes who were the original European inhabitants here in Philadelphia. If you look at the flag of Philadelphia, it actually correlates to the Swedish flag. So from there, you think about William Penn, establishing this space in the 1680s, but then you have to go to the very next spot in 1684 when the Isabella brings the first big waves of people of African descent here in the city of Philadelphia. So we're going to talk about two individuals and how their lives connect with this history. And when you unpack a person like Cyrus Bustle, you have to think about their parents, his parents, a woman named Parthenia and a lawyer who had contacts with the Penn family, Samuel Bustle. So Cyrus is born in 1732. It's really important to kind of, again, those connecting the dots of early America and his what he saw in his life. Now, we know that Cyrus, in his words, was owned by more than one person. And after Samuel Bustle passed away, Cyrus ends up being sold to two other people, and the latter being a man named Thomas Pryor Jr. He will teach Cyrus the baking trade. And it's fascinating because Thomas Pryor was a Quaker, and in the 1760s, there was tension within the Quaker faith, the Society of Friends, about contacts of enslaved people. Germantown Quakers not really understanding the concept of enslavement. So there was tension, and it's not a neat fit. There's this notion that all Quakers just were against slavery. That's not the case at all. But Thomas Pryor was someone who wanted to ensure that Cyrus had a particular trade, had a skill set, and their relationship was fascinating to think of, that Cyrus did not take a lot of hostility to his interactions with Thomas Pryor. Now, I know he wanted to be free. Why? Because he wanted to ensure if he wanted to get married, that they would both be free. And he did just that. What coincides with this is the birth of a young man right here in this neighborhood, you could say a Ryan Howard home run away from where the museum is right now. James Fortin, who was born in this neighborhood in 1766. So just at the age when James Fortin is 2 years old, Cyrus Bustle was 37. And in 1769, Cyrus will get his freedom. And from there, he will continue his work in the baking trade, and it will actually cross into the life of James Fortin. So I told you earlier that Fortin was born right here in Philadelphia to Thomas and Margaret Fortin in 1766 on September 2nd. And his father introduced him to work in the sail making trade right here in Lower Dock Ward, what we call Old City here today. And it's a fascinating story of James looking at the skill craft of his father, Thomas, also the teachings in a different faith base, being instructed from Christ Church. And that would ensure James an Episcopalian background or Anglican at this point. So James is learning from his father, but unfortunately his father passes away when he is 7 years old. And now James is going to, with the help of his mother, begin learning at a Quaker school right down the street from where we are right now by a French Quaker named Anthony Benezet. Now, Benazet is a really interesting figure, sort of was a failure in his first businesses, but decided he wanted to be a teacher. So he taught Quaker children by day and he taught free and enslaved children at night. And what he came across was he remarked about how incredible it was working with these people of African descent and noticing that they were just as smart as the white children that he dealt with. So James is going to take the lessons that he's learned, and it's only 2 years of education, but James is going to take those knowledge and he's going to do odd jobs in this neighborhood, and he is going to go on to make his own revolutionary connection. So here's where the threads come together. What does service during the revolution look like? Well, guess what? It takes many different shapes. How does a baker impact the war? Well, you need foodstuffs. It's a real challenge. There's they call them the Baker General, a gentleman named Christopher Ludwig, who is organizing bakers across the colonies to ensure that troops get the adequate food that they need. We don't know exactly why Cyrus decided to use his skill set to help the revolutionary cause, but he does. And there are 2 instances, one in his Burlington community, and then later in 1777, 78, he is also going to hitch his own wagon, and he's going to take goods out to Valley Forge, where troops need them out there. And this is his way of giving back. And what you see here on the screen is actually a commendation letter. And you can, I'm gonna talk about someone else who's a part of the family that Cyrus actually would never know, but I'll mention her connection to the story in a bit. Now, James's story is a bit different. James is right here in this neighborhood. So guess what he's seeing? He's seeing all the events take shape. He's seeing the delegates come up for the First Continental Congress right across the street here at Carpenter's Hall. The hullabaloo of events that are taking place at this time, the explosion on the waterfront of ships moving goods in, the blockades that are starting to take place, the challenges, all that, the burials of the dead. He's going to see the war begin. But what's really important is the scene that you see right here is what James actually hears as a 9-year-old. He sees Colonel John Nixon or Sheriff John Nixon come out of what is then known as the State House on July 8th, 1776. Now I asked, when I was on tours, I used to always ask, imagine if you could go back in time, where would you want to be? Would you want to have the opportunity to hear the words of the Declaration of Independence read for the first time? James Fortin is a tether to that moment. He heard those words read for the first time, crouching through the crowd, figuring out what does these words mean to him and how he's going to be able to serve his community. Now he's young, he's 9. So the nuances and the machinations of the war is going to start to take shape here, and he's following through that. So when his turn comes, he's begging his mother to have the opportunity to actually serve. And he gets his chance and he serves as a privateer. He makes a good choice because now he can pick what captain he wants to join. He can use his skill set in working at the sail loft of Robert Bridges. He can use that knowledge from his father and from Bridges and from the other journeyman there to actually go and do some good on a privateer ship. His first tour, successful. Takes out ships, gets goods, has money in his pocket, stands right down the street from here. The concept of the painting Braves Men has ever fought, he is standing there with his hat, watching troops of the Rhode Island Regiment pass through the city of Philadelphia on their way to Yorktown. He's proud. He's energetic. We don't get that caption of African Americans and their contributions in the Revolutionary War. He's engaged. He's a young man, but he's engaged. So then what happens? His second tour. Well, unfortunately, he's captured. And he's captured, and he talks about never wanting to be a traitor for his country. Because guess what? He has the opportunity to go with the captain, John Baisley, on the Amphion to go back to England after Captain Baisley asks if he can actually watch his smallest son, a 12-year-old boy, Henry. James does that role. They become actually friendly. And it's an interesting look, an interracial connection. And there are going to be several themes through this conversation. That's one of them. Where do we get to see relationships between Blacks and whites and compelling stories where it's just natural and authentic? Well, this is one of those instances. Then on top of that, after James decides he will not take that chance to go to England with John Baisley, he instead will take the dreaded space on the lower decks of the Jersey, a prison ship that's docked in Brooklyn. And what does he do? Another act of service, another act of character. He has an opportunity to escape that ship, but he doesn't. He gives it to a younger man, a white man named Daniel Bruton, 13 years old. How about that? On that ship. I look at these young men here. I know you're older than 13. Think about that. So he gives up that spot to Daniel Bruton. Guess what? They become lifelong friends. It's a fascinating look at the interpersonal relationships of people as well. So those two moments give you insight into their revolutionary bona fides. So let's see what they do with that. What do they do when they leave the spaces in the concept of the revolution? So here are some of the connective threads. Now, Cyrus Bustle in 1787, just 4 years after the revolution has ended, will be one of the founding members of a new organization, the Free African Society. Well, he'll work alongside Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, two ministers here in Philadelphia, one of the Episcopalian faith, the other Methodist. And they will work to establish an organization, one of the first that will help people of African descent get on their feet. And he's taken his Quaker leanings and he gives a discussion, a speech about what he feels the role of African Americans can be in this early republic. And he talks about staying patient, being true to yourself, overarching themes of not having hostility in your heart. And it's a really important message that we get to hear in Cyrus's words, not someone speaking for him in his own words. So you'll see some of the challenges that will come in this new country. One of them we're facing right now is this pandemic. Well, in Philadelphia in 1793, they had its own nasty version, the yellow fever epidemic. And guess what? People of African descent answered the call. Physician Benjamin Rush asked Richard Allen, can you help? Now, earlier in that 1793 period, Dr. Rush worked with congregation members of the African Church of St. Thomas to help raise the church. They worked together in August of 1793. A month later, they're now asking Allen and Jones for help in taking care of the sick and burying the dead. And even in this period, it shows, again, the challenges in interracial differences. Dr. Rush had a concept in his mind that people of African descent were immune to the disease because of their locality to the Caribbean, where yellow fever was much more susceptible. That wasn't the case at all. People like Fortin, Richard Allen, they had been here for multiple generations in the city, in the region, either Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. So that wasn't the case, but guess what? They answered the call anyway. Many of them got sick, including Richard Allen. Now it's just fascinating, again, because it speaks to the intergenerational part. Now we don't know what Fortin's responsibilities were at this period, but I'd like to think that he's looking at the leadership, the Black leadership at this time, and thinking, boy, I learned a lot serving with different people. How can I impact my community when I get my shot now that the war is over? Well, there's another woman on the screen. I shared with you earlier that little snippet of a woman who actually did end up working with James Fortin. And that's a descendant of the Bustle family, Sarah Mapps Douglas, an ardent educator, someone who worked with her mother, who worked with James Fortin to establish an early school for children of African descent here because they knew that the educational system was poor. And they knew that education would be one of the ways that they would be able to raise up future generations. So Sarah Mapps Douglas ends up being the head of a school that we know today, then as the Institute for Colored Youth, and what moved on down the line is now Cheney University. Now, to think that if it wasn't for the work of Sarah Mapps in telling the story of her grandfather, Cyrus Bustle, who she never met, because Cyrus passed 2 years before Sarah was born. So what does that tell us? Oral history. The importance of being able to tell one's legacy down the road. Intergenerational learning. Who did she learn from to tell her story? Again, these themes of education, they're going to come up time and time again. So while we continue to look at connecting these dots, look at all the various institutions and people who Cyrus and James touched in their lives, not knowing that they were going to be able to do all this. Mother Bethel AME, the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, and that's another one of a connection of, again, interracial challenges. One of the things that I notice with where racial relations are right now is there's always some new organization that needs to be started. Well, how much work has been actually done seeing what worked in the past and what didn't work and re-examining that so we have a better understanding of some of the trappings that our ancestors went through? Because Sarah Mapps talks about some of those challenges of not listening to the words and actions of women of African descent. And it's really important that we learn these lessons and we hear the challenges that come from some of our religious differences, our differences in the vocations, differences in money and what our social status is. These are really important to unpack, and it's something that we can peel to today. Then, of course, I think about the Pennsylvania Hall burning in 1838. This is a really seminal moment in the life of Philadelphians, but especially someone like James Forten, who worked so hard to ensure that this hall that was dedicated really to the abolition of the institution of slavery went up in fire within a week that it was open. And to think that here's a man that we can trace back to the reading of the Declaration of Independence, and who in his 72nd year has been stripped of the right to vote in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. What does that say as we think about the other individuals who are going to come after him, such as the man that you see at the bottom of this screen? Because though they will never meet, in a lot of respects, Octavius Valentine Cato is going to take that baton from James Forten. Why? Because when African Americans get the right to vote in 1871, on that election day, Octavius Valentine Cato, a graduate of the Institute for Colored Youth, whose fiancée, Caroline LeCount, was working to desegregate Philadelphia's trolley cars, a graduate of the Institute of Colored Youth. Sarah Mapps Douglas will go on to become the first African-American woman to apply to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. And then another student from the Institute of Colored Youth, Dr. Rebecca Cole, will be the first graduate of that institution. So it's really, really crucial that we begin to connect these dots and how we get to where we are now with the low numbers of Black entrepreneurship to where we are today. And when we think about education, our educational system as well. And I say that because look at some of these numbers here that we have on the screen. Just 32% of Philadelphia third graders read on a grade level. You see a bar that goes through where Philadelphia ranks within the state. That's about out of 725 school districts, we're 698. And these are still the same challenges and same problems that Sarah Mapps Douglas and James Forten and Grace Douglas were trying to fix. Doesn't mean it's all bad news. And I don't want everybody walking away from here saying, well, we can't fix this. There's a lot that we can do. But I think the stat that's most glaring is, and I asked a buddy of mine, Jason, who was here, who is the owner or co-owner of Katika. And we talked about Black business in 2020 with that 2% number. And he said, yeah, there's an underground economy. So that takes it to about 26 and 8%. That's what the Black population in the 1830s was. The percentage of businesses run by African Americans was higher in Philadelphia in proportion in 1838. How is that possible when the institution of slavery was on during this time? That really gives you insight on some of the challenges that we can figure out through history, through the timeline, through sliding down and seeing where these spaces meet. So when we look at James Forten and we think about those connections of his life and how he wasn't able to vote, but to think that he had somebody like Daniel Bruton who went on his behalf to vouch for him, I think that's an incredible moment to think about. And to also think of the conversation that these two gentlemen had, Daniel Bruton had on James Forten's deathbed. And him going to him to talk about their lives and the conversations and the friendships that they have and saying to themselves, what are the possibilities? How hopeful should we be for the future? Well, I think we should be hopeful. Because right here in the city of Philadelphia, during our recent election, Philadelphia was one of the cities that swung the election. I went to high school with Omar Sabir, our local election representative who was responsible with making sure that these votes were counted. I went to high school with him. It just moves me to understand that he is a part of this legacy. He takes his step alongside James Forten and Octavius Cato and Caroline LeCount. So we all have responsibilities. We all need to be able to zoom into history and localize it. Like Jen said, that's so important. You can do this in your neighborhoods. You can do this by going on walking tours. You don't need to be wealthy. I had no money and I was out giving tours here in Philadelphia with just a hope that empowering people to see, especially these spaces in Old City, you walk past here now and it's a lot of wealth and you don't see yourself if you're a young African-American, but this was space that was owned by people of African descent, the Richard Allens, the James Fortens, musicians like Frank Johnson. So we need to connect this history and have people be able to see themselves in the legacies of these individuals. So as I conclude here, I just want to think about James Forten and Cyrus Bustle in another light, further down the road in the late 1800s, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. There was a fierce rivalry between these two men. One, Booker T, who established Tuskegee, wanted to ensure vocation was the way out of enslavement. The other, Du Bois, talented 10th, wanted arts, humanities to be the catalyst out. How about both and? Because Cyrus and James had both skill sets, craftsmen, baker, artisans. But they also, late in their lives, Cyrus he retired and he establishes a school. Forten uses his influence in industry to also start schools. So let's think about how and what we can do together. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're gonna do questions in just a moment. I love that. So hold on to your thought for just a moment. So we're gonna get our text set up. I want my friends who are joining us via Zoom to go ahead and start dropping your questions into the chat box. We're just gonna do a real quick tech switch over, make sure that we have all of our materials set up, and then we're going to dive into questions. So if you all have been jotting notes down in the audience, be prepared to get those out and read them aloud. We're going to have our master of ceremonies, Lonnie. He's going to have a handheld microphone. He's going to be moving around this space. And so when you have a question, just raise your hand or otherwise make yourself known, and then he will come over to you and you can speak into the microphone to get your question asked. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat that question for the folks who are joining us via Zoom to make sure that they heard that. All right, and then for my friends on Zoom, I'm going to be having your questions shared directly to me, and I will make sure to read those aloud for the folks who are here in the room with us so that we can really engage in a conversation. I'll ask the first question maybe, and then I'm going to open up to everybody. I know who my second question is going to be, and let's turn this into a real dialogue. Does that sound good, folks? Yes, awesome. All right. So number one, thank you to the both of you for your amazing presentations. I feel really energized. And even though I have the opportunity to work here and learn some of these stories all the time, even though I'm sitting here and I'm just like, that was new to me and that was fascinating. So I hope that other people who are joining in virtually and in person are also feeling energized and like you took something really interesting out of this. So I mentioned at the beginning that part of this program is a speculative exercise. So it's trying to sort of understand how might this nation have been different if these stories that you all are lifting up had been told throughout our nation's history, right? From the moments that we had people of African descent who were deeply engaged in the founding of this country, who were demonstrating bravery and patriotism and sacrifice, if those stories had been repeated outside of the Black community in particular, because we know those stories weren't lost forever, right? The work of Mother Bethel lifts that up. So asking this speculative question, how do you all think that the world might have been different today if people had continued to carry those stories forward?
Well, there's one person that means a lot to me growing up, and that was Paul Robeson. And to think that it was late, it wasn't that many years ago that I found out that Paul Robeson was a descendant of Cyrus Bustle. And that blew my mind, because what if I would have known that as a young person? How much deeper would my connection with American history have been? And I would have been able to center myself, or at least see an idealized person or concept that's connected to it. And I think that's the case for so many young people, that they want to see someone reflective of them in their history, in our collective history. And there were people there who just need their voices to be able to be lifted. So I'm appreciative of that.
So I was saying before we started that it's not unusual when I'm in a social circumstance and people find out that I'm a history professor, particularly the men get really excited. Well, do you teach World War II? Do you teach the Civil War? And I always know I'm going to disappoint them because I teach history from the bottom up. I teach about people like us in the room here, you and me. And one of the greatest joys of being an educator is seeing my students' reaction to the giant table that I've set before them of American history. And I always say it is the biggest, nicest table you can get at Pottery Barn. It is a table that is full of diverse faces and diverse voices. And even at the collegiate level, I still have African-American students who have not gotten the full story. And to see their faces light up and connect with that story and with that history is remarkable as an educator. It's remarkable to see the way they're connecting with other students in the classroom. We can say the same thing too about LGBT history. It's the same thing when I teach these units in history classes. It empowers people. They see themselves in that great American narrative, and it truly is inclusive and gives them a voice.
Mm-hmm. And when people see themselves, how does that change them?
I mean, when you see yourself, you're able to be it takes you on a journey. I call these, like, a lot of these spaces, they're like warp zones. You learn more about yourself when you can have that empathy and you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, but you also see similarities from just even materials. One of the coolest things right across the street at Carpenter's Hall, there are tools in their front foyer many of those tools look like things that would be in some of our grandparents', garages. And that's just one item. Imagine if you actually talk about lessons, educational lessons, or just oral histories that transport people back in time. So that's a really important distinction that we always need to be aware of.
The past is no longer foreign when you see yourself in history.
Yes.
I love that. All right, so I know we've got a question from the audience. So Lonnie's going to bring over the microphone. And once you ask your question, I'll just repeat it for the folks who are joining us on Zoom.
My apologies. My name is Ibrahim. I represent the Philadelphia Achievement Academy. I actually wanted to ask Mr. Idris, back when his slides were still up, if I could go back to, I believe the second and third slides. I was still taking notes.
The question, was that the question slide?
Yeah, the introductory question slide, and
yes.
The slide that talked about Philadelphia being the poorest major city in America, with 2% of businesses being left out. If you can't do that now, I completely understand this. Could I reach out to you later or something?
Sure, I would love to send you the PowerPoint deck. That would be easy to do. Just make sure I get your contact information. I'll make sure I get that out to you. No questions at all.
All right, thank you.
And I think we can probably extend that to our friends on Zoom. So you all heard the question. So the answer is Michael would be happy to share his PowerPoint presentation for anybody who'd like to see it. Let's see, we've got another question in the room. Yes.
My name is Joyce Mosley. I just wanted to add to the question about whether or not history had lasted. I mean, I'm a descendant of Cyrus Russell, and I was telling school write a paper about my history, and I would be humiliated in class by a teacher who would say, it's not true. So not having the documentation to go back and say, this is my history. I am related to Sarah Max. The portrait of James Greene was painted by a cousin of mine, Sarah Max Roberts. So it's hard for kids of color, especially if you're sitting in a classroom just with few of you, to sit there and have a teacher tell you that what you have said is not true.
So this is a friend of the museum, Joyce Mosley, for our folks online, who's sharing that she's descended from Cyrus Bustle, she's related to Sarah Mapps Douglas, and so on and so forth. And that when she had to write a paper about her family history, her educator told her that that story was not true. And so there's a power in being able to document those stories, right? So that you can say, no, we know that this happened. And I think that we see that for sure in the descendants of the Perkins and the Dennis families, right? Which is the ability to see those documents, like what they showed in the video, brings everything to life. Let's see, so we've got some questions both online as well as some questions I've got myself. So I think I'd like to know, how do you wish that people encountered these stories? So we're all public historians, right? We're here in a museum, you work at a park, right? We know that these stories get lifted up sometimes at like libraries you mentioned, and sometimes art centers and things like that. Articles are written in newspapers and whatnot. How else do you wish that people encountered these stories?
I think definitely the classroom space at a young age is one of the most important spaces to introduce children to the diversity of the American experience. I think there's a long way to go in social studies changes to the curriculum, what age students learn their history, how they're learning their history. It's never too soon to start kids learning history. One of the programs that we have at Red Bank Battlefield Park, we start them in preschool. We have a program called History Tots, and we don't shy away from historical topics. We get their hands literally dirty sometimes, 3, 4, 5 years old, and get them excited about learning history. History can be fun. It can be exciting. It's not a passive activity. So for me, it is something that comes at at that young age. And then I do think that to reiterate what I said in the presentation, our local communities have amazing opportunities to learn this history. Woodbury, which is a town just down the street from Red Bank, maybe about 10 years ago, residents formed a Black History Club. And it just started off as a casual thing, like a reading book club, a research club, that grew into wonderful Juneteenth celebrations every year. And actually, as now they're working with Woodbury Public Library on a grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities to document enslavement in the Woodbury area. So that was just a group of people with a shared interest that has blossomed into something remarkable and amazing contributions to the South Jersey community.
That's fantastic. How about you, Mike?
I agree about starting in the classroom. I'm very lucky. I feel like growing up in West Philadelphia, going to William Cullen Bryant Elementary, I had great teachers, teachers from different races who were really, really committed to making sure that I knew the stories of people of African ancestry. And I remember vividly community plays, scrolls of just gewgaws of information of different people. When I say different backgrounds, I'm talking about people like Elijah McCoy and Jan Matzlinger and Dr. William Hale and all these individuals who weren't necessarily noted. They weren't your Harriet Tubmans and your Booker T. Washingtons, but they were just regular people. And I think sometimes, if especially with Black history, luminaries get so big that they're not relatable. And I want every gentleman here at this table to be able to understand the stories of James Ford. Even though he was wealthy, doesn't mean that you can't relate to what he was going through. So it's about making it relatable, it's making it accessible, and it's really about localizing it in a way that makes it digestible too, and not me thundering down from the lectern, but asking questions, making it conversational. Some of the best classes I've ever had in history at school were when we went off subject and we started just talking about our backgrounds and what our classrooms look like and what our neighborhoods look like. That's invaluable. We have to be able to have sort of those collective conversations that we can triangulate that knowledge together so we can learn about each other.
And before I go to the next question, which is one I'll pull from our friends on Zoom, I actually want to know from everybody who's joining us, both here and online, like, how do you all wish that you could encounter these stories? Like, certainly it's nice to put on a forum like this, right? So that people can join us, whether they come downtown in Philadelphia or whether they just log in through their computers. But like, where else do you all wish that you were getting this information? How should we be sharing it with you? And I'd love, maybe we can get some of our Zoom responses to that. I can read some out loud, but I also wonder in the room. Yeah, we've got one right over here.
My name is Brian, from Philly, Chief. I think how we can really experience this is like really going on like tours outside, really just going, like really just visiting the places that you guys just mentioned, every day, really.
Awesome. So we're hearing field trips, right? Getting people out into the community, taking them to places where interesting things, whether they were battles or whether they're sites where people lived and interesting things happen. I think that's fantastic. Let's see, we've got another answer back in the back of the room. We've got one maybe over on the right-hand side of the room, and then we've got another response to that in the front.
So, you know, I'm really, I'm gonna survive the fall, right? I grew up in Philly with and got us to different schools. And to me, the history that we were taught was, to me, his story. It wasn't the truth. So how do we get the truth to the year-round coastline? Look down the city. We're a diverse city. You get to Montana, you get to some of these places. You heard about what's happening in Mississippi, where the kid that was working for FedEx was shot at by two white men. yesterday, doing your job. The truth, I don't think it's ever going to be told the way that it should be told. So how do you handle that? It's never going to get, if we got 13% of all Americans dying, how are you going to get everybody to believe what the truth really was? And how most black people built this nation when people don't even want to hear it nor believe it. And now it's called critical race theory.
Okay, so for the people who are joining us via Zoom, I'm going to break this question down into two parts. So the first part of the question is really, how do you get these stories to people who might not be in population spaces that are highly populated by people of color and people of African descent? And then the other piece of that is, how do you get people to really engage with and believe that these stories are the truth when they might otherwise be inclined to believe that that's not real history? Okay, so I wanna take a piece of that question and actually roll it into my previous question. How do we get these stories out? Because again, I do wanna get your feedback. You chose to come here, you chose to join us on Zoom. Where else do you wanna encounter that information? And then I'll throw the rest of that question to our guests who are up here. So where else do y'all wanna encounter this? I'm also looking to see if we've got people who are dropping responses to that into the Zoom. But for folks in the room, where else? Is it enough to just come here to the museum? So we've got right here, we've got over on the right-hand side, and then up in front.
Mindset of the country. This is something that has to be, talked about, brought up, taught. Because there was a time when colleges were teaching African Americans. They said you make that kind of course, the babies and like that. So it was a where it was not before there was now. It just has to start early, elementary school. We have to really tell the truth. I grew up in West Virginia. I went to dominant high schools as I was blessed. But I can remember history where slavery was like a really quick 2-second conversation. You turn the page and that was it. Not to say that, I didn't get a good education, I really did, but in terms of backstory, it's I don't know how it's truthful. It's not always told. Okay. And I think a little Americans are talking about, like, they don't really want their children to know that story because it's sad. It's mean, it's talking about, it's approaches times, but it's the truth. I think that's what we feel sometimes, like not wanting to hear the truth.
Thank you. So what we're hearing from our guest in the room who grew up in West Oak Lane is that, echoing some of what we heard at the front of the room, that it really needs to start as early as possible in formal educational environments. So what are we doing in elementary school? What are we doing with our tots, right? How are we teaching the youngest people, right? And then there's also this question about, how do we maybe get over the fact that sometimes hearing these stories can be painful and can be challenging, and make sure that we tell the truth anyway. Yeah, okay, thank you. So go ahead, we've got one right here.
Basically, I wanted to piggyback off what he said and also say something about him speaking on the fact that we do live in a place where, African American studies isn't necessarily a mandatory teaching in Philadelphia, because that's something that we experience. We have open conversations constantly in my classroom at Carver. I go to Carver Engineering Science, and those conversations can be so diversified with how they're taught. And with that being said, it opens up the ability for us to really engage in those information that we're given. Now, to go on a adult, because people live in worlds where they were never really open to that. Something that I feel like gets the information out towards people, even though it's not necessarily I wouldn't say a great way to do it all the time, but I do feel like it does help, is doing it through media. So that would be through television or through like comedic videos or something like that. Those really do help some people understand the topics that aren't really being talked about in schools at a younger age.
Mhm,
That was my take.
Thank you. So our young man in the front is saying that he gets to have really open and really powerful conversations in his school classroom, and that makes a difference. And he's also noting for our friends online that creative media is something that can be really useful to get the word out about these stories. So the use of television, the use of videos and things like that can reach a wide audience or a very specific audience, but those are ways that you can get people to listen and be exposed to things who might not necessarily come to a historic battlefield or come to a museum. Absolutely. All right, let's see. I'm going to check and see if we got any responses in the Zoom room around that. Okay, all right. So no, none from that, but I do want to throw it back over to our folks here. See if you have any responses to what you heard so far. Oh, we got one more.
Hi, my name is Wendy Stark, and I'm a fourth grade teacher outside of Pittsburgh, and I teach in a predominantly white school district. And as I listen to some of those conversations and I listen to some of those success stories that you have heard, I'm sitting here as a fourth grade teacher saying, I wish I could have those same experiences, because so many of the social studies teachers that I have in my district, we are almost, and I hate to use the word afraid, but very hesitant. We look at some of the things that we teach in history now and we go, well, maybe we're not going to talk about that. And when we, whether it be the Native American or the African American history, we've started to step away because there is a fear. So as an educator, I've always loved history. I grew up with a father who loved history, and he immersed me in it. I'm from central Pennsylvania, so the Gettysburg Battlefield was there, Philadelphia was there, Washington, D.C. was there, and I was lucky enough to experience that. And I've passed on that love to my children, who now is in historic preservation, a graduate of Penn. But as a history teacher, it saddens me that I'm hesitant and that I'm afraid. But every day I'm like, no, I just finished Benjamin Franklin. No, we're not, no, maybe not. But I don't have that guidance. So as an educator, I would love to have that continuing education, to have that guidance, to have that knowledge, where I personally seek it out because that's my love. But so many in the teaching profession are hesitant and they're afraid because they don't want their children to go home and say, well, in the classroom, we had that discussion. No, we don't really have those open discussions, or we're told to shy away from those discussions because you don't want those children to go home and say something and something comes back for you and there's nobody to back you up on it. So that makes me sad. So I'm happy to hear that there are those conversations and those things happening, but I know for myself, we're afraid, we're hesitant.
Yeah, that's a really powerful thing to hear. And I think that we've been hearing that from teachers all across the nation. And a lot of the work that we do when we're communicating with teachers, that some of them are being told that there are stories that they should not be sharing because they're afraid that there will be a reaction about that. And so the question becomes, how can we bringing the light of truth to these conversations that are taking place at all levels, both within our schools and within our communities, within our states and at the national level? How can we make sure that the light of truth is brought to all of those conversations? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. And how can we remember that there's a way to feel proud of our nation and all of the things that it's done while still recognizing the challenges and possibly find opportunities, as both of you lifted up, to see how interracial cooperation makes us better?
We need to give each other more grace. You're working to learn something that was not always accessible to you. My wife grew up in a very small Wisconsin community, and I always like to triangulate what she learned in school versus what I learned in school. These are conversations we as Americans need to have. We need to not be afraid of having stark, hard conversations. This is not all on African Americans. In unpacking this history, it doesn't have to be so heavy, but we do also need to give each other space to grow and also be able to understand how complicated this history can truly be. But through conversations, through understanding and hearing one another, we can open up bigger spaces, more dialogue, and have a far richer understanding. One of the spaces and stories I love to tell the most is Lehigh Avenue in Philadelphia. Because if you know anything about sports and Shop Park, when the Phillies were out there, you basically saw a neighborhood grow around a baseball team. And you also saw what happens when the baseball team started to suffer and more African Americans began to move in that community. You got to see white flight. We don't talk about white flight and the impact of that. So there are a lot of stories. In 1967 story, I look at these gentlemen right here in Philadelphia, where school kids protested the school board and were whipped up and down the Benjamin Franklin Parkway by Frank Rizzo. So these stories talk about Sarah Maps because you had youth, elementary, middle school kids who started that protest. Why? They wanted to know their history. It wasn't being taught. That's 1967. We're still figuring things out. So those stories, again, show that push-pull in history, backlash. That's where we need to look.
I'd also like to add that as a parent, I have 2 children in public school. We're in New Jersey. New Jersey obviously is a different curriculum than Pennsylvania. So my heart goes out to the teachers who are trying to do this good work and feel like they can't, that their hands are tied. You know, years ago, New Jersey passed the Amistad curriculum. And so we take for granted in New Jersey, I think, we have a good curriculum. It could be stronger. But, you know, kids do have access in New Jersey and teachers are supported with teaching this type of content. But I have to say the worst thing as a historian is to get that feeling in the pit of your stomach of, oh no, here we go again. It's happening all over again. When I was a young graduate student, one of the first books I read in public history was by Gary Nash, a giant in the field on the protest over the history standards in the state of California. So when all this hullabaloo came about, I thought, oh my gosh, and Gary Nash had passed at that point. I would love to have known what he had thought about all of this. But, you know, the conversation about how we teach race in the classroom has been so politicized. And really, I feel like we can trace this moment almost directly to the publication of the 1619 Project. That's what got everybody's attention. That's what got everybody so fired up. And it wasn't all the other historians included in the 1619 Project, like Kevin Cruz, who was a white professor at Princeton University. It was Nicole Hannah-Jones, and it touched a nerve. So, you know, trying to document better, more completely is always going to receive pushback. But I think within communities, we need to think about who are we electing to our school board. We think very carefully in our town who we want on our school board because we know they're going to support a particular curriculum. And I'm not saying that that's easy to do in places like, you know, Western Pennsylvania or in Montana or North Dakota. It's challenging. But, you know, there are opportunities to affect change at a legislative level, to advocate for curriculum change. It's not easy. It's a long fight. But, you know, if we've learned anything, you know, this too shall pass, you know, and I do think it will pass as long as we keep advocating for the change. That's the continuity, the consistency that needs to continue happening, is that we're not going away. We're not going to be silent. We're going to continue to advocate and do the work until this is fixed. And that's a long fight. It's 200 plus years, right? And we're all still here fighting. And so just have to continue on.
Mm-hmm. I want to lift up some of the responses that we've gotten from our Zoom room, in particular in response to my question about what are some of the other ways we can get these stories out. I'm hearing from Mary that she would like to see podcasts that get lifted up by mainstream platforms as ways to deeply dive into these historical stories. Public libraries and their various programs can be important gathering places and vehicles for stories. That's from Doris. One thought is to have historical interpreters tell the stories. Making the stories more real could be more effective. That's something that we have a ball with here at the museum. And Mike Idris gets kitted up as Cyrus Bustle and talks about baking and contributions to the Revolutionary War effort. Some of you may know that we actually do an occupied Philadelphia program where the British take over Old City Philadelphia, and that is a blast. I mean, maybe we should be sending historical interpreters to occupy other spaces in the city and tell other interesting stories. I don't know, but let's see. So let's ask some questions. Let's get an another question from the Zoom room. Let's see. Will Dr. Janofsky please tell everyone how and why Washington finally decided to create the Rhode Island Regiment of African American and Native American soldiers with Christopher Greene as their leader?
So interesting. So obviously, at the beginning of the war, Washington is opposed to the idea of using any type of Black labor in the revolutionary cause. When Lord Dunmore comes up to Virginia and says, hey, enslaved peoples, why don't you come fight with us for the British side will offer you freedom? George Washington has this moment of, oh, that's not good. That's not good at all. After the Battle of Red Bank in 1777, everybody's wintering at Valley Forge. And I think one of the fun things about being a historian is trying to envision the conversations that were happening, right? It's freezing cold, everybody's demoralized. Washington realizes he has a major problem on his hands. These guys can't fight. It's not looking great for the Patriot forces. And I imagine this conversation between Greene and Washington, where Washington says, Chris, we don't have many guys from Rhode Island. You got a lot of guys who are sick, who are died. Your numbers are down in Rhode Island. I need you to go back to Rhode Island and get me more guys. And I feel like Christopher Greene's like, man, have you seen the size of Rhode Island? Like, there's only so many people in Rhode Island I can give you. But how about you think about this? My crew from Red Bank, you may have heard what they did in that battle. How about I go back to Rhode Island and we work on bringing enslaved folks into the fold of the Continental Army? And I think this is like a real moment for Washington. Speaking of podcasts, if you like podcasts, and I love history podcasts, the Mount Vernon series on the enslaved lives at Mount Vernon really gets at Washington's changing ideology. He's not a static figure, a static moment in time. George Washington in 1778 is not George Washington in 1775. And the podcast does a really nice job of sort of capturing his worldview and how it is like slowly, sort of at a glacier pace changing. But I think seeing what African Americans did at the Battle of Red Bank absolutely influences his decision to recruit enslaved peoples from Rhode Island, definitely.
And shout out to our friend Brenda Parker, who's at Mount Vernon, because she's been deeply engaged in that podcast project. She does costumed interpretation here at the museum for us as part of our Meet the Revolution program, and she is lovely. So I'm going to ask another question from our Zoom room, and then maybe I'll take a final question from the room. So let's see, moving forward, what do you think is the best way to advance the knowledge of African-American participation in the revolution and contributions to society when faced with the opposition that we're seeing? What is the best way to handle conversations when the difficulties arise?
Well, I believe in multi-point, multi-sensory, meet people where they are. So really all cards should be put on the table, whether it's primary resources, obviously, like Joyce talked about. We need primary documents that lock people, that lock information that we know, we hear it directly from their mouths. Newspapers, that's really important. But also maps, also community organizations that actually connect to this history. So archives and repositories, spaces like Mother Bethel AME and all their incredible work that's there. It goes to local memory. So that's your elders in your community and being able to hear from them. And when I talk about intergenerational, it means both. We're listening to the youth, but the youth is also listening to the previous generations, because I don't like anything to be in a vacuum. This needs to be engrossing and needs to be all encompassing. And that comes from funding, capital. We need resources to be able to do this and lift up databases and have people be able to share information. I know here in Philadelphia, like a lot of our historic churches, they're pooling their information together to say, where are we missing? Because guess what? African-American culture, a lot of our history, our words are in stats. They're in figures. They're in baptismal records. That's where you hear our voices, and it's like the hidden history. So we need to put all of that as like an aggregate to really flesh out these important strings together.
So at Red Bank, when we first started to tackle this question about Black participation at the battle, one of the first people I reached out to was Joe Becton, as many of you know. Joe is former National Park Service Ranger, It does living history interpretations in Philly and the Delaware Valley area. And I invited him to Red Bank because I wanted to have a conversation. I wanted him to educate me because he was the person to speak to about this moment. He had researched the topic. And when he came to Red Bank, I was stunned because he had a suitcase with him. And I was like, why do you have a suitcase, Joe? And it's because he brought every book from his library on the subject.
Michael and I both know Joe, and we're both
Right?
picturing
And,
this
like,
happen.
It's like it's in his car. It's like it's everywhere. And I was like, well, why did you didn't need to do that, Joe? And he said, no, but people don't believe me. And I want to show you. And he starts opening the books where he had like dog marked pages and Post-it notes and stuff, because he wanted to show me the source material. And I think, when you're working with the public, that's a great approach. Show them the source material, whether it's on your historic signage like we have at the park, or, one of the great things about working with small groups in public history is just giving them the information and letting them see it. Museums, there's this famous study that was done a while ago, but in the study, it concluded that museums are one of America's most trusted sources of information. It's not me as a college professor, it is the museums. People believe museums because museums put the evidence out there. They put the documents out there. They put the images out there. They put the objects out there, and they let people come to their own conclusions. And so as museum professionals, public history professionals, that is an amazing responsibility and an amazing opportunity to reach people. People don't like being told what to think. They want to see it themselves. They want to come to their own conclusions. And so if we can offer them that opportunity, at Red Bank, it has been remarkably effective. We get very little pushback on our tours. People actually, people are really excited to hear our tours. They are really excited to learn this information. We have amazing, wonderful volunteer docents, including Bob Barnshaw, who used to work here at the Museum of the American Revolution, Jeff Pollack, Robbie Taylor, Harry Schaefer, give tours of the battlefield every week. People line up every week. There's no issue. There's no problems. They walk away saying, thank you for sharing these stories.
Wonderful. So I think we've got time for one more question in the room, our final question. So let's see. It looks like we've got a hand right here. Yep.
Time. All right, good afternoon. I didn't want to say good morning. I just had to double check. But I guess my question for you all, the amazing work that you were sharing about how with the American Revolution, there is an absence of documented history there, right? But we also live in this age of information where documentation of things is not the problem, right? We have so much information out there that misinformation is the problem, right? So as the history buffs, like where do you think how do we measure truth? How do we share truth? Because it seems from the work that you're doing now that documenting it hadn't helped, from the revolution. And today, with us documenting everything, that's not necessarily solving the problem, because you can document anything you want and put it anywhere you want. So how do you measure truth today?
Well, in the field of history, there are benchmarks that you're supposed to hit. When you write papers in history, you got to get to Chicago style, and there's where you source things, and that's really, really important in the age of the internet, Facebook. So many people are just not really understanding what a primary resource is, or what a secondary resource, how it corroborates that primary resource source and send someone on a trail. You have those breadcrumbs to go to look at information. That's really important. But it also goes, in the African culture of oral traditions, in actual items that connect to the past. The powder horn here, that's a real tangible item of to be able to Gershon Prince's powder horns, that we have this item that's so important that tells a particular story and that has customization into it. So it's really about making sure that we have a real understanding of what a good source is, because it's so sad to see many generations of people being lost to disinformation, to misinformation. I know people here in this room have family members that have gone down that internet rabbit hole and think that the information that they're receiving is factual when in actuality it is not, and it's doing damage. So we need to really have, our standards of what good information is, and be able to give respect to the historians and those that do the work, but then also understand, again, those local historians, those people who are not degreed, who should be respected just as much as a lot of our, accredited historians. We need all in that pot, not just one in a vacuum, not telling a story. So we need all of it.
One of the things that I think is great about my job is, one day I'm in a classroom at Rowan University with college students, and the next day I'm in a park giving a tour to a group of people who don't necessarily have a great background in history. So, I think one of the great things about what's going on with the digitization of history right now is its accessibility. It's sort of democratizing information and accessibility to information. Everyone can be their own historian now, whether it's on the Library of Congress's website or here at the American Museum of the American Revolution. There are amazing cultural resources making these primary source documents available to people. And again, that is the power of seeing it in your own light, seeing it in your own eyes, and drawing your conclusions. All throughout history, people have manipulated information to suit a particular agenda. So I think when people sometimes ask me, well, how can I learn more? Who should I be looking at? Who should I be reading? These are conversations that, talked again, as Mike just said, to the local community leaders. What are you reading? What's on your reading list? Who would you recommend? What site do you think I should go visit to learn more? I think so much of this is so powerful in our interpersonal communications, with just at the local level and just within our families, about how to get access to that information.
And I feel like the subtext of that is that we need to be teaching people from the earliest age possible how to assess the sources that they're interacting with, right? We need to be teaching people how to use historical thinking strategies. Who created this material? Who was this material created for? Why is it being shared in the way that it's being shared? Who benefits from this information being shared, and who loses out? Right? There's a million questions that we need to be teaching folks from an early age how to assess these materials, but then we have to reteach that constantly, all of the time, right? And we also have to figure out strategies for how we talk to our peers in ways that are non-condescending, right? Because it is not helpful for us to demonize people who are different from us or who disagree with us politically or socially. That builds walls, and what we want to do is break down walls. So how is it that we can interact with folks in ways that encourage them to use historical thinking strategies that don't come off as holier than thou? I feel like those things are really key and underlie everything that you're saying.
Like Mike said, meeting people where they are.
Exactly.
I think that's absolutely crucial in conversations like this, is understanding, first of all, where they're coming from. And what is the outcome that you want to have happen? If you want a conversation, then you have to pause, right? And you have to listen. I always teach my students as public historians, the best skill that you can have is not talking, is listening. You have to listen. And when you listen, then you can better, have a more productive conversation. They don't listen, Mike.
One of the things that I feel so excited about from this conversation and from the engagement that we've had from people via Zoom as well as in this room is the sense that we are all aiming for the same thing, right? We all want a future that is better, that is brighter, that is more promising, that is more equitable, right? For all people, right? We're trying to make sure that our families are safe. We're trying to make sure that our schools are safe. We're trying to make sure that the children in our communities have a great education. And it sounds like we have the beautiful basis for like strong allyship in this space. So just reaching back to what Denise said, how is it that we use this information moving forward as tools and as weapons to shed light, right? The light of knowledge upon the world. So with that, I want to turn things back over to Lonnie for some final words from the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust. Thank you both so much for this. This is amazing. And we can.
Thank you, Adrian and panelists. Just another round of applause for that open dialogue. Just one point of correction for those who are here in attendance, the surveys that I had mentioned, which I thought were inside of your folders, you will actually be able to access them. We'll be sending out an email. Is that correct, Phil? So you'll receive an email for you to complete that particular survey. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our Vice President of Development, who's actually my first cousin, and he's also a 7th generation direct descendant of the Dennis Perkins family. I would like to introduce to you at this time, Daryl Gore. Okay, I started. Ready?
Start. Well, I don't know about you, but I've learned quite a few new things this afternoon. Got a glimpse of the African American community in the 1700s and 1800s that I thought I knew a lot, but there's a whole lot that I learned today, and there's a whole lot we all need to learn. And I just hope that we can understand the truths that we discussed today, the truths about how African Americans contributed to the growth of this country, how we can do better in sharing our knowledge, and we can understand how we can interact as a people, both African Americans and non-African Americans, Native Americans. We all need to do a better job of interacting and teaching other people. But I'm here because I'm the Vice President of Development for the Dennis Farms Charitable Land Trust. So my job is to put out the tin cup. We have an important initiative with the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust. We have a 153-acre farm in upstate Pennsylvania where there's a farmhouse that we want to convert into a museum to share the story of not only the Dennis and Perkins family, but also African Americans in Northeast Pennsylvania, excuse me, that have been a part of that part of the state since, again, the 1790s. So what you're seeing behind me are our goals for creating the Dennis Farm Museum on the Dennis Farm. You were looking for contributions. We were involved in a capital campaign initiative to fund the renovation of the farmhouse and convert it into a museum. So that we're asking that you go to our website, www.thedennisfarm.org, and consider making contributions to the reconstruction of the farmhouse. We're trying to match a grant that we received from the National Endowment of Humanities to renovate the farmhouse. We will receive $400,000 if we can raise $1.2 million. Now we're making progress in that, and I can tell you that we have some exciting news. We have actually started the reconstruction, which was something that we couldn't say last year. So we have exciting news, but we're still a ways away from having the funds to complete the job. I'm asking all of you here in the room and all of you that are participating wherever you are on the internet through our Zoom meeting to consider making a donation to the Dennis Farm to help us reach that goal. I would like to personally thank the Museum of the American Revolution, Zean, Leanne, Adrian, and everyone else who has been part of our partnership now. Was it 4 years, Lonnie? 3 years. 4-year partnership where we've immeasurable support for our efforts, and especially immeasurable support for the Lonaé A. Moore Forum on Racial Understanding. we can't tell you how much we appreciate that. But we also want to thank our speakers, Dr. Janofsky and Michael. Just fabulous, wonderful, wonderful information. It's just fascinating stuff. I just hope you feel like you've been educated the way I feel I've been educated. And I'm kind of a history buff, and being the direct descendant of Prince Perkins and having my sister Denise, making sure that I know the history of our family to find that additional information about African Americans here in Philadelphia. It's just so fascinating to think that you have Jane Fortin, who probably walked these streets right outside the window, and all these other people, the African Americans at Red Bank, and that was all a very small community. And Lonnie's mother was a member of Mother Bethel AME Church. All that history is right here. It's such a privilege to be here in this area and have that kind of history. But what we need to do, because it's becoming much more difficult to do that, is share this history. And I want you all to remember, always consider your ways that you can share this history. One of the things that Denise has always told Lonnie and me when we're telling our story is document, support it. And now I can see the importance of that. So I want to thank you all. I thank you all for taking time out of your days to be here with us, not all of you in the room, and all of those who are listening to us or watching us on Zoom. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be with us. I hope you have a safe trip home, and I look forward to doing this again next year. So all of you have a great afternoon. Don't forget to spend some time down in the museum to see the exhibits here. You remember, as far as you're being here, you get the free ticket to the museum. Go look at the exhibits. Enjoy that. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.